They say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Well, the colonizer doesn't fall far from Europe either. Those passports become real handy when it's time to defend your ancestral homeland. Speaking of settler colonialism, we now move westward to the land of Emir Abdelkadir al Jaza'iri. From 1830 until the end of the Revolutionary War in 1962, Algeria was under the brutal occupation of the French Republic. Yes, you heard that right. That's 132 years of the mass murder, dispossession, and subjugation of Algerians by a people whose only claim to Algeria was nothing more than historical delusion. The parallels between the French occupation of Algeria and the current Israeli occupation of Palestine are no coincidence. Both European settler projects, French and Israeli colonial attitudes are not only imbued with a white savior complex and an astonishingly high degree of entitlement to land that's not even theirs, but both France in the past and Israel currently attempt to construct an image of a benevolent, morally upright champion of freedom and democracy while systematically carrying out the most atrocious acts of violence, exploitation, and dehumanization of the occupied. In the fervent struggle to break the chains of colonialism, there can be no truer fraternity to the Palestinian resistance than that of the Algerian people. Let's take it back a bit. When speaking of the Algerian resistance, the legacy of Emir Abdelkadir al Jaza'iri inspired what would become one of the greatest and bloodiest anti-colonial struggles in recent history. Born in 1808, Emir Abdelkadir was a venerated Islamic scholar and military leader who led his people against the French colonial invasion. Like Izz ad-Din in Palestine, Emir Abdelkadir was raised under the auspices of his father, a notable spiritual leader of the Qadiri Sufi order. By the age of 14, the Emir had memorized the Quran, was immersed in the traditional Islamic sciences, and had studied an array of subjects including philosophy, medicine, and mathematics. Known as a true embodiment of faith, Emir Abdelkadir's struggle was one of chivalry and courage that even his staunchest enemies would sing his praises. With his unwavering faith and unrivaled military genius, the Emir and his fighters proved to be an absolute menace in the face of French colonial ambition, leading a 15-year-long struggle through expert guerrilla tactics, strategic negotiation skills, and visionary leadership. However, of course, the French, being French, descended to ruthless tactics of violence that forced the Emir to surrender and face exile from his homeland. He would retire to a life of devotion and scholarship until his passing in 1883, never having stepped foot back into his beloved homeland again. Fast forward to the decades leading up to the Revolutionary War, the French occupation of Algeria tightened its brutal grip on power, sensing the brewing currents of resistance. What's important to note here is that unlike the other French colonies in Africa and the Middle East, Algeria was considered an extension of mainland France, completely stripping the Algerian people of their right to self-governance. Algeria thus became home to over 1 million French and European settlers. Just imagine what it was like. French settlers traveling in hordes from Europe arrived on the shores of Algeria, sold on the belief of a new life in France's new promised land. Guys, at this point, it's really not hard to see where Israel learned how to Israel. Yet again, drawing parallels between the French and their Zionist protege, words cannot begin to describe the sadistic nature of the colonial mind. Just to give you a glimpse of this cruelty, the French occupiers enacted some of the most egregious acts of violence ever documented in modern history. The Setif genocide of May of 1945 witnessed the massacre of up to 45,000 Algerian Muslims in a matter of days. This was on top of the routine torture and execution of civilians, the use of collective punishment against entire villages, the systematic use of rape and sexual violence against Algerian women, and not to mention the psychological warfare through state-orchestrated propaganda. All of these crimes were committed by French soldiers whilst candidly posing for pictures next to the corpses of their victims and taking the decapitated heads of resistance fighters as trophies to put on display in Paris. Trembling with ire in the face of such savagery, iconic figures of the Algerian resistance rose out of the ashes of destruction. They were often referred to as outlaws, bandits, and yes, of course, the classic label of terrorists. These heroic resistance groups included the likes of Mostefa ben Boulaid, Jamila Bouhired, Zohra Drif, and Ali Lapointe. These valiant men and women were a part of the military branch of the National Liberation Front. Taking on one of Europe's most militarily robust armies of the time, these fearless fighters, many of whom were in their youth, designed and executed highly sophisticated war strategies, and developed extensive intelligence networks so ingenious that even the French colonial forces were caught off guard. Their fight for liberation became a beacon of hope for the global South, as anti-colonial movements began to spread like wildfire. After 7.5 grueling years, the Algerian people successfully expelled the French from their homeland, bringing forth a new era after over a century of occupation. The ferocity of the Algerian resistance and their subsequent victory became a lasting trauma for France. Having witnessed the rise and fall of 6 governments during the war and the realities of colonization, French public opinion became increasingly polarized. The facade of Western exceptionalism began to collapse as some prominent French figures lambasted Western intellectual and political discourse for their Orientalist conceit. One such thinker was the French West Indies psychiatrist, anti-colonial revolutionary, and radical political philosopher Frantz Fanon. Being a subject of French colonization himself, Fanon's unforgettable experience as a black psychiatrist, treating both French torturers and Algerian victims of war, resulted in his transformation into a revolutionary intellectual. Having experienced the overt racism and depravity of the French military, Fanon was privy to Europe's empty proclamations of humanity and morality, and concluded that the colonized must not count on the benevolence of their captors to gain their liberty, but must fight for it by radical means. Now guys, a few takeaways from this episode. Europe's colonial enterprise, as we have seen thus far in both Palestine and Algeria, does not happen in isolation. It is a deeply malicious exercise of power that is upheld and protected by the global world order. So friends, we should not be surprised when time and time again, the only response to the slaughter of Muslims is theatrical displays of moral distress and empty slogans of never again. We should not be surprised by the silence and the apathy of these global governing bodies like the UN, whose two-tiered power structures only ensures that justice is served when it serves the powerful. What both Palestine and Algeria's resistance movements show us is that in order to resist and eventually dismantle the colonial architecture of our world, we must first recognize the colonial logic that weaves itself through each and every story of resistance. There is no such thing as post-colonialism. Colonization never ended. It simply adapted. It sits in the world's highest seats of power. It is safeguarded by the military-industrial complex. It dominates in our institutions of so-called intellectual freedom, and it pervades even the most mundane aspects of our everyday lives. This, my dear friends, is not a call for despair, but one of hope. I wholeheartedly submit to you to consider the power of courage in a world that is governed by cowardice. The likes of Emir Abdelkadir, Mostefa bin Boulaid, Frantz Fanon are just a few names amongst the millions of faces of revolution. They were men and women, just as you and I, who refused to accept that one person's contributions cannot change the course of history. In the depths of this darkness, they carried out dreams of a new birth, knowing full well that the power of their oppressors, no matter how fortified or long-lived, is never immutable. May we be given a fraction of their courage to speak truth to power.